Scott here on Flip That Script. And today I wanted to talk to you about the interrelated topics of revenge, karma, and forgiveness. Feeling like you either want revenge or want to know more about if and when and how toxic, narcissistic, abusive people, and maybe even more especially so because it's family, you might want to know either how to get revenge or when they're going to experience karma. I think these are normal feelings, especially kind of when you first go through your awakening process and really start to recognize or acknowledge their abuse and just really see it for what it is. Start to see the forest for the trees and the pervasive pattern of the dynamic that you've been caught in. This relates back to what I've talked about in recent videos. Everyone wants to be treated fairly. Everybody wants to experience justice, balance, and reciprocity in their relationships with other people. A lot of anger is not only likely to erupt when you first recognize this and or set strong boundaries and or end up going no contact. That anger is very important to your healing as well. Now think of anger as a message. All of our emotions really are messages. They're part of our feedback system. So feeling anger is very normal when it comes to recognizing, like I said once again, that you've been in an abusive relationship or dynamic. The important thing to remember is that while anger is a normal emotion and appropriate in the context of something like this, anger is something that actually has pain and hurt underneath of it. Anger is kind of a normal human emotion and response to feeling pain and hurt and sadness and kind of wanting to push it out. So what I can say is that beneath that anger are these other more vulnerable emotions. And as you start to work through your anger and face the grief and sadness, profound disappointment, your anger is kind of serving to protect you from those difficult, painful feelings underneath until you can kind of break through to them and connect with them and feel the actual vulnerability of those raw, difficult emotions. You will find, or at least I think you will find, and I found in my case, although I'm going to go into more detail with these 3 issues on my next video when I go into more summarizing my own subjective experience and emotions and healing, etc., of my no contact period, which is now going on 3 years. But as you start to connect with and feel and experience, work through, process, and eventually release these more vulnerable feelings, and as you progress along, as they over time begin to dissipate, but can also certainly be triggered at different times even as you heal, as I mentioned in the previous video. As you start to connect with those and work through those, you will naturally start to feel less of the anger, which is kind of your outer, more protective emotion that was guarding these more vulnerable feelings until you're ready to deal with them. I think that you'll find that feelings like wanting revenge and preoccupation with things like wanting them to experience karma will also kind of begin to dissipate and fade with time. The other thing that I can tell you on the 3rd subject of forgiveness is that personally, and it's a personal decision to make, I think that forgiveness ends up being the high road that you should take. I'm not at all suggesting that it's easy or that it comes quickly. There's plenty of articles that you can read on the subject of forgiveness, and when I got to the point that I felt like I wanted to make the conscious choice to forgive, you can read a lot about what forgiveness is and forgiveness isn't. I'll go into some of that here, but the reason I think it's important to get a perspective on what forgiveness is and what forgiveness isn't without reading and learning about different perspectives regarding what forgiveness is and isn't, then you can't really make a decision about whether you want to make the choice to forgive and without knowing exactly what it is and how you view it with some input that I strongly suggest you get yourself acquainted with, then you can't really evaluate your progress with forgiveness. To me, forgiveness is something that very much first requires, at least probably for most people, the time and the distance of your no contact. As you begin to heal and grieve and feel less of the emotional impact of how the abuse and mistreatment affected you, this can open up more space and make deciding to and progressing with forgiving them becomes much more feasible and something that has potential. It makes sense to not rush this because I feel that in the overall scheme of your whole process, that it's kind of one of the things that come last. It would not be realistic for the forgiveness to come quickly or easily. And I think it's much more important that you honor your own humanness or human nature. That, again, it's something that takes time, and it definitely takes some work. To me, forgiveness is not condoning their behavior and the abuse you experienced. It's definitely not dropping your boundaries and opening up yourself to experiencing it more. So it's not forgetting it. I also think that it's quite possible to forgive toxic, narcissistic, abusive family members without having contact with them and without ever reconciling. Now, from what you've learned about all of these issues, true reconciliation is not really something that's possible because of the issues that make them abusive to begin with, and the fact that they're not accountable, and so on and so on. Forgiveness, to me, is learning to liberate your heart and your mind and your soul from the pain of what you've experienced. This is not to say that the pain is not there, but it's part of not allowing it to dominate your heart and your mind and your soul so much. This is why I think the healing work of dealing with your emotions is so important, to come a long way with that before you start to look at and explore and think about forgiveness, what it means to you. and then working on consciously making it part of your overall way of moving forward and becoming more whole again. So again, I feel like when you don't forgive, then you're not letting go. Again, letting go is not easy, but this is why, to me, in the way I look at forgiveness, why I consider it an integral part of healing and moving forward, because it's not failing to acknowledge that what happened was wrong and unacceptable, but it's choosing to no longer let it have as much power over you, over your thoughts, over your emotions. It can be very freeing and liberating, because if you go no contact, but you're going to continue to dwell on what happened and the injustice of it, which is normal, but I'm talking about if for the long haul you're going to continue to dwell on it and feel like you really want to know when they're going to get theirs, or be thinking too much about how you're moving forward in life and healing and having a new chapter in your life that doesn't include them, to me, when you've forgiven, then some articles and some YouTube hosts will talk about you living a good life as being revenge. I don't think for the long haul it's good to view that as revenge as much as creating the best life for yourself that you can as part of love, healthy self-love, and honoring yourself and your right to have a life that's free of abuse. So to me, forgiveness is part of that whole letting go and giving what happened to you less power and giving it less energy, less mental energy, less emotional energy, less thinking about them and how they are and what they did. So to me, in the long run, and when you're ready to explore this, I highly recommend forgiveness. It's a process, and what I wrote in my autobiography. It's a process that makes you, over time, achieve a state of grace and a state of, I guess what you'd say is humility. We don't mean the kind of humility where you roll over and let people abuse you, even though that being abused is an integral part of your life experience. But a humility that you can move on, and even though they violated you, you also don't really want to aggrandize yourself with an attitude of how dare they. To a certain degree, yes, in the early stages. but as you move along in life, to me, ultimately, it's a state of grace from which you may sometimes waver, but less so and with less frequency the more you work on finding a way in your heart of letting it go and it's also something that can be more fostered over time as well. The more that you learn about abusive personalities, toxic relationships, narcissism, the more that you come to understand just how deeply troubled your abusive family members truly are at their core. And even though they're hurting, and there's the saying that hurt people, the important caveat to that is that not all hurt people because we have been hurt, but we believe in rising it above it and not hurting others because of what we've been through. But it's kind of like the more that you come to understand their deep-seated issues and problems and trauma, and the fact that regardless of whether you believe it's a choice or not, there's lots of controversy over that. But the fact that they're not really dealing with their core issues, and that narcissism, which is a very dysfunctional and harmful maladaptive response to those things, which ultimately, if you think about it, when it comes to karma in its own way, it does catch up with them, so to speak, because of how dysfunctional it is. Because, hey, look, they lost their relationship with you if you've gone no contact. But the more that you come to understand why they are the way they are, on a certain level, when you heal enough, despite the fact that they've harmed you, etc., etc., over time, this might be able to help you to develop compassion for them, and that compassion can lead to forgiveness, despite strong boundaries or the ultimate boundary of no contact. But I think it's very possible to have compassion for and forgive abusive, toxic family members, but knowing that it will never be any different. Then eventually you can find what I call a state of grace. And to me, that's what forgiveness is. And then in the long run, that forgiveness, along with everything that you've done to minimize or completely eliminate the experience of further abuse, learning to ultimately and finally be able to forgive them and release what happened to you is the gift that you give yourself.